Let me spend a minute just talking about the regulatory environment and healthcare reform. Everyone knows that there are three parts to healthcare reform. Insurance reform, which is really about access, delivery reform, and finally, payment reform. Unfortunately, with about 2,700 pages and lots of complications and expense, I think we got insurance reform. At least my friend Karen Ignani from AHIP tells me lots of reform there. Lots of controversy about whether or not it's going to stay, but it is the law of the land. And there's only been a very small legislative component related to delivery reform. But don't be deluded by that. There is an incredible amount of delivery reform going on today. And I think it's really important for the pharmaceutical industry to understand, perhaps with more detail than is typically part, what that delivery reform looks like and what are the opportunities and risks for product development. And finally, payment reform, which was touched on in the legislation, but from my perspective, having done quite a bit of work in the area of payment reform, not nearly enough, because once again, we're talking about making changes, tweaking within the current model, but not fundamentally changing the assumptions about how we pay for healthcare in this country, who pays, and what the requirements are to determine that. The objective, regardless of whether or not we agree about the nature of reform and what has transpired, is that we share a common objective. We want to get better health outcomes, better health at lower cost. There is a ceiling with regard to what we can spend on anything. And clearly, how we define the objective depends in large part on the viewer. But in any case, it's going to require a fundamentally different way of thinking about your business. Lots of different constituents when we think about healthcare. It is big business. And I have been called an equal opportunity critic. It's a title that I wear quite proudly. And every one of these constituents, regardless of the role that they play, has had an impact in getting us to increase cost, increase utilization, and again, questionable value. And below this, there is a whole level of distribution, pharmacy benefit managers, third-party administrators, and a variety of others that make the whole thing work. When you have something happening in one part of the system, it clearly affects the other. Every constituent is affected by change, and everyone believes that change is necessary, but they tend to play the NIMBY game. Not in my backyard. I think change is great, but we are doing a great job, thank you very much, in our sector, in our particular company, and so forth. If we look at healthcare reform in the United States, and we zero in on that for a minute, there are a lot of things that we know. Tip of the iceberg is really what's known. About the tax, increased access to generics, in part brought about by pharmaceutical manufacturers being really precluded from making changes to their products by looking at labels and therefore delaying the entrance of generic drugs. We know that there are more people that have gained access to prescription drugs. We know there's a lot of red tape with regard to transparency. There's concern about the relationship that pharmaceutical manufacturers have had traditionally with physicians. And in a nutshell, the problem there is mostly one of perceived too much influence. What this has meant is increased pressure on pharmaceutical marketing efforts. We know that there's been decreased access on the part of pharmaceutical reps to a wide range of academic as well as community institutions, and they also have somewhat more limited access to payer decision makers where they're trying to get products on formulary. There's a bias in the industry, as I listen to the political debate and others in the industry in general, that the pharmaceutical manufacturers have really been responsible for increasing the cost of healthcare in this country, even though we know that on a percentage basis, the pharmaceutical component is relatively small. And then a belief that all the physicians are really in the pockets of the pharmaceutical companies anyhow, which is why we want to minimize the amount of influence. But the real issue is what's less known, and Michael touched on this briefly in his opening comments. And that is the issue of comparative effectiveness research. And from my perspective, the United States is very much a laggard with regard to CER. This has been a dominant theme of pricing and reimbursement outside the United States for many, many years in developed countries, and it's also an issue in developing countries. It was a centerpiece of the stimulus bill in 2009. It was written into every bill that was even considered in the whole run-up to PPACA. It obviously appears in the legislation, even though it takes up a relatively small part. And it, from my perspective, is really going to radically transform the way in which our government reimburses, approves, and makes available drugs in the marketplace. CMS does see CER as the solution to the problem of healthcare cost containment, and unlike the process that is used pretty much in the UK, we are not looking at it from the standpoint of QALYs, and we're not looking at it merely from the standpoint of products. It also is going to involve the kinds of protocols that are used in healthcare delivery. So the challenge for the pharmaceutical industry is not so much can we get doctors to prescribe our products, and then can we get payers to make sure that we're on formulary and make sure that we're at the right tier. The issue going forward, from my perspective, is going to be, do we get our product baked in to the treatment protocols that healthcare delivery organizations are going to be needing to demonstrate value. So the 5 most important impacts from the standpoint of CER, we see the death of the blockbuster model, increased pressure to develop products to meet really unique patient needs. Talked already about the increased competition between branded and pharmaceutical, rather generic drugs. And the other thing that I think is really important is we're going to be looking at comparisons of drugs to drugs, not just drugs to placebo-controlled trials, but drugs to whatever the gold standard is today. And we're also going to be looking at it in terms of one of my favorite interventions, which is watchful waiting, or as my brother, who's an internist, likes to say, tincture of time. One of the things that I think is very important is we look at what's happening in Europe, particularly in France and Germany, where the role of CER has really been enhanced, kind of CER on steroids. And the requirement now, and this is just beginning to unfold, is that new products coming to market will not only need to demonstrate safety and efficacy, they're going to have to demonstrate superior performance relative to whatever the gold standard is today. So the point here is phenomenal pressure, phenomenal competition and pressure, downward pressure in terms of pricing, but also pressure on pharmaceutical manufacturers just to get their products into the market in the first place.